Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about rational choosing. And really this is going to be kind of a takeoff or sort of another way to add value to our thinking about the ways in which people are rational. So in the rationality lecture, I go into some ideas in terms of game theory, especially thinking about the sequential nature of an interaction that naturally might be modeled using either backward induction or forward induction, and thought about like iterated elimination of dominated strategies as a way to kind of think about ruling out behavior that a co-player might have that we decide would simply not be consistent with our assumption of rationality. In this lecture here, I'm going to think a little bit differently, and I'm going to kind of think more carefully about how people go about achieving their goals and actually what those goals are from the standpoint of optimization, but then also revising optimization and then thinking about introducing a new idea called satisficing. Then a little bit later on, I'm going to think in terms about how we ought to analyze a particular game given our understanding of how we ought to partition states of the world. And this can give us very different interpretations of a particular interaction. I'll do this in the context of Newcomb's problem, but then in a future lecture, thinking about cooperation in the context of a repeated prisoner's dilemma game, we'll think about reframing prisoner's dilemma and think about how that could be a completely different game as well. So anyway, again, here's my dog. She's got a cone. Like I said, this is always more useful for me because if I talk long enough, that becomes the thumbnail on my desktop. So anyway, the references for this lecture are from Dave Schmidt's Choosing Strategies, and what Nozick did for decision theory. Again, Schmitz and then Wright. So we're thinking about a situation where we've got a decision maker and we're thinking about reflecting about what type of goals that decision maker might have, and realizing, well, in economics we'll model somebody as having a preference structure. So we're considering that our decision maker has a set of alternatives ranked in terms of utility. This is just saying we're assuming they've got some type of preference structure. Now, what do you do once you've got these preferences? Well, an optimizer selects the alternative that ranks at least as high as any other, right? So an optimizer is going to select an alternative that ranks at least as high as any other. And the reason why we might say that we might not just say that our optimizer chooses the most high alternative is, well, optimizer's typically going to choose relative to some constraint. Our satisficer is going to select any alternative that one considers satisfactory. And so notice, and I'll kind of develop this logic as we go forth, but the optimizer is trying to choose like a high ranking and is going to choose an alternative that is at least as high as any other. If we have a tie, okay, now we might have two optimal bundles. But if we have an explicit ranking where one ranks higher than the other, definitely we're going to assuming it satisfies the constraint, the consumer, the decision maker, is going to choose the highest alternative. Satisficing is a little bit different, where the satisficer is going to set some minimum threshold, for instance, of quality that they're seeking. And once they find a bundle or an alternative that reaches that minimum level of quality or of minimum satisfactory level, they'll just take it. And so you could have a situation, certainly, where the satisficer ultimately is stopping their search far before they might come up with what would ever be the highest ranked bundle. They're just going to set a threshold, and as soon as they find one that's going to reach their criteria, then they'll choose that option. So let's reflect on this, though. This seems a little bit counterintuitive relative to what we've done in economics so far. So let's reflect on the question: why should anyone ever select a suboptimal alternative? Well, the big answer here is search costs, right? That we face this cost in terms of being able to determine all the alternatives that are actually on the table and then choose between them. Search is costly, and especially where search is substantially costly, it just might not be worth it to go and try to inspect every alternative, right? So in the real world, we don't have a nicely ordered menu. We might have nicely ordered preferences, but we don't have all the options on the table before us where we could go and see this nice clean ranking and then go to the top of the list. That's not how it works. So firstly, there's search costs. It's costly to go and enumerate, to identify, to catalog every possible alternative, and then to inspect them, to compare them, and determine which is going to be the highest ranking alternative. So our implication is, well, maybe we want to stop the search when we find the best alternative, or maybe we stop the search when we find one that's reaching some satisfactory threshold. What's the problem? Well, the problem is with optimization, this requires choosing whichever is judged best, but not necessarily the best all things considered, right? So we ultimately want what's the best, but if we take other things into consideration, such as search costs, maybe it's not the best because maybe we're wasting time in trying to find the best possible paper towels or whatever, right? So the important observation is, well, if you insist on searching until you find the best possible alternative, you might be wasting a lot of time and resources. It just might not be worth it. So someone who stops their search upon realizing that continued search is not worth the cost is still optimizing, but the optimization strategy here is more subtle than usual. I'm not yet talking about satisficing on this slide here. Someone who stops their search upon realizing that continued search is not worth the cost is still optimizing, but the optimization strategy is more subtle than usual. This is a type of recognizing that there's other important constraints, right? So here, if you find, all right, well, additional searching is going to, cost of additional searching is going to outweigh the benefits, we better stop now, that can still be optimizing. This is different from satisficing. How? Well, with satisficing, what you're doing is you're just stopping as soon as you found a satisfactory alternative, irrespective of additional search cost. Now, you might employ a satisficing strategy because you've recognized that prolonged search is not useful or leads to strongly diminishing returns. But satisficing, actually the satisficing strategy is just saying, once I found a satisfactory alternative, that's where I stop, right? So stop the search as soon as a satisfactory alternative is found. Relative to optimizing behavior, satisficing invokes a different stopping rule, right? It's like once I've found some instantiation, some item, some alternative that matches some minimum criteria, that's where I stop. So this goes back to Herbert Simon, treats satisficing as a surrogate for optimizing under particular information constraints. People have limited information. Remember, think about like bounded rationality, realizing that, we're finite, limited decision makers, finite, limited creatures. So, all right, mathematically, here's how we can kind of develop this logic. All right, well, at any point in the search, we can think of the expected utility of stopping as U. That's just the utility of the best available option so far. We're assuming that wherever you stop the search, you're going to choose the best available alternative that you've encountered to that point, right? So at any point in the search, we think of the expected utility of stopping as U. This is just the utility of the best available option so far. The expected utility of continuing the search equals the probability of finding a better option, right? Probability, P of finding better option, FBO, right? Probability of finding a better option times the utility of finding a better option, U of finding a better option, minus the cost of further search, C of Fs, right? So the expected utility of continuing the search is going to be P of finding a better option. This is a probability between 0 and 1, times the utility, that makes it expected utility, finding a better option, minus the cost of the search, right? So at some point, the satisficer stops because U is good enough, right? The utility level is good enough. Satisficing is finding good enough. The subtle optimizer is going to stop, well, when the cost of further search exceed the expected utility of finding a better option, right? So the idea is you're looking forward and you're saying, okay, well, the cost of further search exceeds the expected utility of finding a better option, therefore I'm just going to stop. Notice that's a different decision rule than stopping because you found something that's good enough. Okay, so even so, the decision maker employing the satisficing strategy or the subtle optimization rule might end up with the same alternative. However, the decision rules, the decision process leading to those outcomes can be different, right? So for instance, so we say the two might converge to the same outcome, but doing so for different reasons, right? The optimizer stops the search when all alternatives have been considered or when a constraint becomes binding, right? The optimizer finds it, enumerates all the alternatives, chooses the best, or now they've got a binding constraint, So now they're doing constrained optimization. They choose the best within that constraint. That's the optimization rule we're familiar with from econ. The satisficer stops when a good enough alternative has been found, right? So it's not that they've got a binding constraint. It's not that they found all possible alternatives. It's just that they encountered one that's good enough. They're going to make do with what they found. And that's the difference between satisficing and optimizing. Now you can think of a situation where these might end up leading to the exact same behavioral outcome. All right, so here's an example. Think of like the cafeteria example. You're going into a cafeteria, and I don't know. I think of the cafeteria we had at my at school I went to as an undergrad. So we had like you had the commons, and you go in and you had kind of anything you'd want: salads, burgers, pizza. There's a pasta tray. There's a cookies and cakes. I would actually kind of go right to the cookies and cakes and stop by the grilled cheese on the way, because that's what I did when I was 18, 19, 20. So anyway, but maybe you're approaching this with a different goal in mind. So suppose you want a reasonably balanced and reasonably appealing meal. And so if you're satisficing, what are you going to do? Well, you'll take the first meal that's nutritionally and aesthetically adequate, right? So you kind of look around, and the first thing that you encounter that meets your criteria, that's what you walk out with. Now, if you're optimizing, you'd continue looking until you reach the end of the cafeteria or run out of time, right? So if you're optimizing, you want to inspect it, everything. Maybe a better example is thinking about approaching a food court in the mall, right? So you haven't been to this mall before. You know, maybe it's a different town. You don't know what's in the food court. You didn't bother to look. You didn't check your phone. You're just going to walk in, and you know, it's crowded enough where you can't kind of see everything, but you encounter something. I don't know, maybe it's a pizza place. You're like, okay, good enough, right? That's satisficing behavior. Optimizing behavior would be, all right, I'm going to set a time limit, kind of walk around. I'll walk for a couple minutes, and I'll see what there is. And maybe I won't see everything, but I'll just choose the best of what I'm able to see in a couple minutes. That'd be the sort of subtle optimizing decision. You do this in airports, right? So you come to an airport, and then you could look around, and there's some airports where I kind of have a faint sort of foggy idea of what there might be, and because I had been there before, but I don't necessarily know if it's in exactly that terminal, if I got to go to a different gate or whatever is the case. And you might start walking, and though there might be something else you have in mind, maybe you want to go to Dunkin' Donuts and you find something else, maybe a local place. If it looks good enough, you might just stop. That's a satisficing behavior. I'll do that in almost every place, except in Sky Harbor. If I'm in Sky Harbor Airport in the Phoenix Airport, and I want to go to find a coffee shop, I will go to Cartel. And it doesn't matter if I have to get on a bus, go to a different terminal, I'm going to stop at Cartel Coffee whenever I'm in Phoenix. So anyway, all right, so satisficing involves selecting a satisfactory alternative because it's satisfactory, not because stopping the search at any point would maximize utility. Right? Satisficing involves selecting a satisfactory alternative because it's good enough, not because stopping the search would maximize utility. All right, so when is satisficing rational? Well, there's times we simply don't care enough about the gaps between the satisfactory and the optimal alternatives to make it rational to pursue the optimum, right? So think about you're going into the airport example. You're trying to find coffee or something, and you know, you could find coffee at a Starbucks, you'd find coffee at Dunkin', or maybe McDonald's, or whatever is the case. Maybe there's some local shop, and maybe you just don't care enough. You just want coffee, or maybe you just want to take the first available, and you realize, yeah, I mean, whatever I'm able to walk away with might not be my favorite that's available at that airport, or my favorite that's available at that food court, but it's good enough, and it's not going to make me that much more happy to go and find the optimal, especially worth the time. So it could be the case where we just don't care enough about the gaps between something that's good enough and best to make it worth it to try to find the best, right? So for instance, searching for the optimal toothpaste can be a waste of time. Searching for the optimal moment to quit looking for toothpaste can also be a waste of time, right? Just find something that's good enough, and that's what you go with. All right, so when is satisficing irrational? Well, the suboptimal option might be good enough to be chosen, though this alone doesn't mean that this ought to be chosen in preference to something that's clearly better. So if you do have two choices, right? You actually have the two choices. You found both choices. One satisfactory, the other's not. The satisfactory choice is rational because it's better. If both are satisfactory, you can't rationalize the inferior alternative just by observing that the inferior option is satisfactory, right? If you do have both options, one's clearly better, one's worse, you can't say, oh, I'm going to take the worse one because it's good enough, because you've got both there in front of you. So, right, deliberately choosing the worst over the better option would be irrational on the assumption that the better option is just as readily available, right? So when would you choose the worst option? Well, if the better option wasn't readily available, if you're stopping the search because you found a satisfactory alternative. But suppose you find two satisfactory alternatives, at that point, you actually want probably whichever is the higher of the two, because exactly in that example, choosing the lower of the two would be irrational. Right, so satisficing strategies seem reasonable, partially because of these contingent facts about ourselves and the world we live in, right? For creatures limited as we are, satisficing can often make a great deal of sense. Why? Well, we'd hurt ourselves by trying to maximize overall utility in everything. You'd drive yourself absolutely berserk. It'd be just a complete waste of time to try to optimize in everything. That's not what we do, right? Thinking about like different types of small decisions that you make a lot of decisions out of habit. Why? Because your habit has you buying something that's good enough or doing something that's good enough. And so you're satisficing because optimizing wouldn't be a good use of a lot of resources. All right, so here I'm going to stop talking about introducing the decision between, or the idea between satisficing and then subtle optimizing. I think this is important, especially as we're thinking about economic behavior, right? The course is ethics and economic behavior, and I think it's important as we're thinking about the strategies that people use, the way that people go about making decisions, is to understand that satisficing actually in a lot of cases is a pretty reasonable, pretty rational, and actually often employed scheme that people will use. All right, so the next thing I want to do is now kind of, this is still in rational choosing, still talking about rational choosing, rational decision making. I'm going to introduce kind of a couple ways that you'd make a choice, in particular thinking about dominance reasoning and then thinking about like expected value reasoning. So I'm going to do this in the context of Newcomb's problem, which is kind of interesting. And so this will be hopefully a little bit interesting thought experiment to think through. And then this idea of information partitions is going to be really important as we're thinking about how we frame strategic interactions. This is really important. This is like the basis for, in a lot of cases where I'll teach game theory, I'll say it's really important to pay attention to the fact that people might be thinking of the game they're playing as completely different. Like, that's an important assumption when we're modeling a situation using game theory, that people are thinking about the world the same way. And this is, I'm going to bring this out in the context of information partitions here. So here's an example. We'll think about Newcomb's problem. And the idea is to illustrate this important aspect of information. So here's Newcomb's problem. You've got two boxes. Transparent box holds $1,000. A second, opaque box either contains nothing or $1 million. Now you've got a choice. You could take the opaque box by itself, or you can take the opaque box plus the box that's known to contain $1,000. So you're choosing between the two. Right now it seems pretty simple. We'll make this a little bit more tricky. So there's a catch. We've got a predictor who's predicted you will take one or two boxes, right? The $1 million is in the box if and only if the predictor has predicted you will only take the opaque box. The predictor has a history of being correct 90% of the time. What should you do? Right? So you have two boxes. The transparent box, you can see it's got $1,000. Good. There's another box. It might have nothing, or it might have $1 million. It has $1 million exactly when the predictor believes you're only going to take that box. If the predictor thinks you're going to take, or has predicted that you'll take both boxes, it'll have nothing and you'll only walk away with $1,000. And we know the predictor is correct 90% of the time. What do you do? All right, so here we're going to represent this as a decision matrix. So here's one way to think about this. This very well might be the way that you think about writing this down. So here's your choices. Take one box or take two boxes. Here's two states of the world. The predictor predicts you've taken one box. The predictor predicts you've taken two boxes. All right, if you take one box and the predictor has predicted that you take one box, you get the $1 million. If the predictor has predicted you take one box and you take two boxes, now you get $1,001,000. Suppose the predictor predicts that you would take two boxes. Now they're not going to put the $1 million in the box. So if you only take one box, you get nothing. And then what if you take two boxes? The predictors predicted that you would take two boxes, so they didn't put the $1 million in. Now you only get the 1,000. Right? So here M is 1,000,000, K is 1,000. All right. Oh, but there's another way that we could write this down, right? So maybe the way that we partition the world is the predictor's correct, or maybe the predictor's mistaken. If the predictor's correct and you take one box, the predictor anticipated you'd only take one box, they put the 1 million in. If the predictor's correct and you take two boxes, the predictor has predicted that you would take two boxes, they did not put the 1 million in, you get just the 1,000. Suppose the predictor makes a mistake, you take one box, but the predictor thought you'd take two, that was their mistake, they didn't put the 1 million in, you get nothing. Suppose the predictor makes a mistake, they thought you would take one box, so they put the 1 million in the box, you take two, now you get the 1,001,000. Right? So look, there's two different ways to think about the world. We could partition it as the predictor predicts one, predictor predicts two, or the predictor is correct or the predictor is mistaken. Both of these, mutually exclusive ways to partition the world, right? Two mutually exclusive states of the world. Either one happens or the other happens. Right? Okay. So these are each matrix are two ways to represent the same problem. The actions are the same, right? The top row is always taking one box, the bottom is always taking two boxes. The difference is how we're partitioning the states of the world that form the background to your choice. In either case, the world state descriptions are meant to be mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, probability sum to 1. In the first matrix, the predictor predicts one or two boxes. In the second, they're either correct or mistaken. This decision framework follows from Savage, right? Each column is a state of the world. Each column has a probability associated with it. Now, in the first matrix, probabilities are largely irrelevant, right? In the first matrix, that's this one. Probabilities are largely irrelevant in the first matrix. No matter which column, right, you're $1,000 better off taking both boxes, right? In the first matrix, taking two boxes is a dominant strategy, right? Whoops. In the first matrix, I either get 1 million or 1 million plus 1,000. So I'd rather take two boxes, or I get 0 or 1,000, right? So I want to take two boxes if this is the way the world is, right? So I got a dominant strategy in the first matrix. In the second matrix, neither strategy is dominant, right? When you weigh your options, you actually wanted the probability of the columns. Now, that's this one here. That's this one. So now what we want to know is what's the likelihood that the predictor is correct or mistaken? All right. So to people who partition the world states the second way, you should take one box. Right? This partition implies a 90% chance of winning $1 million by taking one box. Right? Here we get a 90% chance of getting the $1 million by taking one box. Okay. So in the first way of partitioning the states, right, implying that you've got a dominant strategy, in some sense there's a mistake. If there's a probability of you being in a state depending on which action you choose, right? Is there a relationship? Is there a dependency of which state in the world is true based on what I choose, right? So suppose it's the case that choosing one box makes it more likely that you were in the state represented by the first column. In two boxes, it would make it more likely you were in the state represented by the second column. Then choosing one box approximates choosing $1 million in preference to $1,000, right? And then playing your apparent dominant strategy would be a mistake. So the implication is that, well, dominance reasoning can be untrustworthy, right? So dominance reasoning in the rationality slides, I introduced the idea of dominance reasoning, the idea that You should play dominant strategies, and you should assume your co-players are not playing dominated strategies. But dominance reasoning could be flawed in a certain sort of way, right? To use dominance reasoning, the idea you ought to play your dominant strategy, start by asking whether we know of a way of partitioning world states such that the probability of being in a given column doesn't depend on the action you've chosen, and the dominant strategy exists when the world is partitioned in that way, that you actually have a dominant strategy. All right, so we can update, following Jeffrey, we can update the matrix to incorporate conditional probabilities now. So here is, well, I take one box, I take two boxes. The predictor predicts one box, the predictor predicts two boxes. So now with conditional probabilities, if I take one box, the predictor predicts one. So this is the predictor predicted one conditional on me taking one. We're saying predictor's correct 90% of the time. Predictor predicted two conditional on me taking two. Predictor's correct 90% of the time. So these are 0.9. Here the predictor predicted one conditional on me taking two. Predictor made a mistake. That happens 10% of the time. And then predictor predicted two conditional on me actually taking one. Predictor makes a mistake 10% of the time. All right, so that's where those conditional probabilities are coming from. If we update the matrix, right, and compute the expected utilities, this is going to be 1,000,000 times 0.9, or 1,000,000 plus 1,000 times 0.1, 0 times 0.1, or 1,000 times 0.9. So my expected utility, right, now is 900,000 from taking one box and only 101,000 from taking two boxes. So the problem with dominance reasoning is it's ignoring conditional probabilities, right? Once we put them into the matrix, now the framework gives us a strong reason to choose one box. So the upshot, the implication is, well, the appearance of a dominant strategy simply can't be taken at face value. On the other hand, sometimes the fact of being the option with the highest expected utility can't be taken at face value either, because there can be a problem with expected utility reasoning as well. So for this, I want to explore the academic disease problem. So Joe has a father, either Stu or Tom. Stu died of an inheritable disease later in life. Tom did not. Stu's disease was genetically linked to an academic propensity. And now Joe is choosing a career. Joe would rather be an academic, other things equal, but reasons that if Joe goes into athletics, Joe is less likely to be a child of Stu, therefore less likely to get the disease. Right? So this is interesting. Joe is thinking, okay, if I go and decide to be an athlete, it's more likely that Tom is my father, not Stu. If I go to be an academic, if I go and be a professor, it's more likely that Stu is my father, and therefore more likely that I've got this inheritable disease. Right? So this is interesting reasoning. People do this when they're thinking about going to the doctor, right? Sometimes people try to avoid going to the doctor because they think they don't want the bad news of having a terrible disease. Well, look, whether you go to the doctor or not doesn't change whether you've got this disease. Like, if you think something's wrong, you better go see the doctor, and then therefore you can hopefully get into treatment, catch something early enough, right? But people avoid this, especially around diseases like cancer. People don't want to go to the doctor because they don't want that to become the reality. Hey, look, if that's going to become your reality, the sad state of the world is like you've got to sort of confront this and deal with this sooner than later. That's the important idea. And same thing here. Nozick is saying, well, it's silly for Joe to decide career on this basis. What Joe actually wants to have the propensity to like the athletic career and not the academic career, and then irrespective of what the career actually is, I suppose. But anyway, there's nothing Joe can do to make it less likely that Stu is Joe's father. It's importantly, well, it's not whether the world state is probabilistically linked to your action, but whether it's influenced by your action, right? Joe can't influence whatever is the true state of the world. Similarly, whether the $1 million is in the opaque box seems to depend on whether you choose one box or two. But what makes conditional probabilities normally relevant isn't present in Newcomb's problem, right? Now, if it was the case that our predicting one box would make it more likely the predictor would put $1 million in the opaque box. Now that would then become part of the action's overall utility, right? So conditional probabilities are indicating this tendency of the action to influence the probability of being in a given state, but they need not. And when they don't, they're not as relevant as in the kind of conditional probability we have in Newcomb's problem. So what's the problem? Expected utility reasoning can give us the wrong answer because it leads you to think that your action is producing the preferred outcome when in fact your action has nothing to do with what's in the box, right? So you ought to take the two boxes. Anyway, so this is the important part now is kind of twofold. Firstly, thinking about the role of the information partition when we're thinking about how to arrange the states in the world, when we're thinking about be it a decision problem or be it a game that we're modeling, some strategic interaction, the way that we partition the states of the world is really important for the subsequent analysis. The second thing is calling for deeper reflection into the applicability of dominance reasoning and then expected utility, expected value reasoning as well. All right, so I will actually bring back this information partition thing in the cooperation and coordination lecture. And so this will come up in the context of thinking about how we frame the prisoner's dilemma. Just, kind of foreshadow, there's kind of two ways that you could frame the prisoner's dilemma. One is the standard version. So each player has a strategy to cooperate or defect. And then the alternative way to partition it might be my co-player plays like me or my co-player plays different from me. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this lecture. I hope to see you in the next one. I'm going to go ahead and sign off now.